Can you tell us a little bit about what your session was about?
Yeah, I called it What's New in the English Language. And my idea really was, well, firstly, to give teachers a few ideas about what's happening with the state of English today. Principally British English, obviously, because that's where I'm based. I'm based in London. But I also wanted to have a look at the way in which English was changing in other parts of the world too. So we had a cursory look at the way in which Chinglish, for example, is developing, and Hinglish, the variety of English that is a mixture of Hindi and English, as well as Singlish, the language spoken in Singapore, which is a mixture of Malay and English and Chinese. So we looked at those as well. And I was also looking at some of the mechanisms of language change, really by looking at words, thinking about, for example, in technology, we have an enormous number of new technological words entering the English language every year. And one thing that's always interested me is where these words come from. Because these words never come out of the blue. There's always a reason for them. And in fact, there's very often mechanisms for them as well, which we can analyse. So I was hoping to give teachers just a few ideas about where these words come from, how they're generated. Because if the language changes, then obviously the way we teach it changes. So language change, I think, is highly relevant to...
And what do you think are the best ways for teachers to keep up with this language change?
Keeping up with the language changes is always very, very difficult for anybody who isn't living in an English-speaking country, because the impression that one gets is always so partial. It's very, very difficult to actually determine which words are here to stay and which words are going to go. Obviously there are lots of websites and newspapers and articles that cover this, but definitively, I suppose we can only really say that a new word joins the language when it ends up in a dictionary. And as we know, although some dictionaries publish supplements every year, lots of dictionaries are quite a long way behind the language. So my point really in my session was more saying, well, if one's familiar with some of the mechanisms of language change, then you can spot how things are happening. You might, if you are living in Turkey, you won't know exactly what the language of the street in London is, and how could you possibly unless you were there.
And what languages are having an influence on the language that's spoken in Britain?
Well, the language that's spoken in Britain is influenced by an enormous number of languages around the world. Reports tell us that over 200 languages are spoken in London alone at the moment, an enormous number. And certainly some of this seeps into the language of the street, mostly I think through schools, in fact, so that, for example, just one word that we looked at today was the word nang, which means kind of cool, excellent. And it's used a lot by kids and also used a lot in street slang. We believe it comes from Bangladeshi. It's from one of the Bangladeshi languages. Obviously a huge Bangladeshi population, particularly in East London. And the kids take some of the language from the home into the schools, and the language becomes cool and ends up in the street.
And for the teachers themselves, what do you think the criteria should be in how the teachers themselves decide on the kind of English that they themselves would like to speak and use?
I think the answer to that has to be that teachers have got to pick a standard model which they're using to teach from. Otherwise, I think you are all at sea. You have no idea which variety to pick. And so it seems eminently sensible that teachers pick on a model like standard British English or standard American English, as is taught in the course book. Depending on geography, depending on their background, their education, where they've learnt their English, if they've learnt English and they're not native speakers, whichever one they feel more comfortable with. That seems sensible. At the same time, it also seems sensible to alert students to the fact that there are all kinds of different varieties of English being spoken in the world today, and they need to be aware of that. If you speak standard British English, you can't necessarily expect to pitch up in the middle of Glasgow and understand what everyone's saying.
Good. Thanks very much, David. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thank you.